You need to pay close attention to what is unfolding around you now, because August 26th is not carrying the energy of an ordinary astrological day. On this date, the Sun moving through Virgo forms an exact quincunx with Neptune in Aries, and although that may initially sound like one more technical aspect in an already crowded sky, its deeper significance reaches far beyond a single transit. This moment belongs to a larger celestial pattern that has been developing quietly, and its purpose is not simply to create movement around you, but to bring hidden illusions into your awareness, including beliefs and assumptions you may have carried for years, or perhaps for what feels like entire lifetimes. There are three particular illusions connected to this moment that deserve your attention, because once something hidden becomes visible, it becomes much harder to convince yourself that it was never there. And if you have recently noticed something unusual in your body, perhaps fatigue that seems difficult to explain, or sudden sensitivities that appear without an obvious cause, do not dismiss that experience too quickly. There is a specific connection to the energetic picture unfolding now, and that connection will become clearer later. Before reaching that point, however, you need to understand why August 26th carries such unusual psychological intensity. You are not waiting outside of this energy. You are already moving through it. The Sun and Neptune quincunx acts as a pressure point within a much larger configuration. And that configuration is known as a yod, sometimes described by astrologers as the finger of God or the finger of fate. The name may sound extreme, but the geometry of the planets explains why this symbolism feels so compelling. Pluto is currently retrograde in Aquarius, while Neptune is retrograde in Aries, and these two extremely slow-moving planets are connected through a sextile, creating a cooperative relationship between forces that operate on a collective and generational scale. Their influence has been developing gradually rather than arriving all at once. Then the Sun reaches approximately 3 degrees and 47 minutes of Virgo, entering the precise pressure point created by this configuration. At that moment, the Sun becomes the apex of the yod, the concentrated point where the broader energy of these enormous planetary forces is directed into one sharply defined area. And what does the Sun represent in your personal experience? It represents your identity, your ego, your awareness of yourself, and the conscious story you hold about who you are. That is why this configuration can feel so personal, even though its foundations involve planets that move slowly enough to influence entire generations. The collective pressure is being focused through the most personal part of the chart, bringing something much larger than yourself into direct contact with the way you understand yourself. Imagine a vast amount of energy gradually being gathered until it is forced through one extremely narrow opening. That opening is your individual sense of identity. This is also why the quincunx deserves more attention than it usually receives. Unlike a square, which tends to create obvious tension, or an opposition, which places two forces directly across from one another, the quincunx operates through incompatibility and adjustment. It can feel like two areas of your life are attempting to function together, even though their natural operating systems do not match. Virgo and Aries approach life from completely different directions. Their elements, modalities, and polarities do not naturally synchronize, so instead of giving you one obvious conflict that you can easily identify, this aspect can produce a persistent internal discomfort. Something feels misaligned. Something does not fit. Yet you may struggle to explain exactly what is wrong. You might continue with your normal routines, continue making plans, continue telling yourself that everything is manageable, while somewhere underneath that surface, an uncomfortable awareness keeps growing. That is the nature of this energy. It does not necessarily arrive with an unmistakable confrontation. It can enter quietly through uncertainty, mental fog, emotional discomfort, physical sensitivity, or the strange sensation that the version of your life you have been maintaining no longer fits as naturally as it once did. Then, eventually, The pressure reaches a point where something can no longer remain hidden. The illusion begins to fracture. What you once accepted without question may suddenly demand to be examined, and the most unsettling part is that you may realize the illusion was not imposed on you by someone else. You may have been participating in it yourself simply because it helped you feel safe, organized, or certain. That is why this moment can become a reveal rather than merely a transition. The first illusion brought into focus is the belief that you can control everything. This is especially important because the Sun is traveling through Virgo, an energy strongly associated with precision, analysis, organization, categorization, and the desire to account for every moving piece. Virgo, at its healthiest, can be remarkably capable, practical, observant, and effective because it wants to understand how things work and improve what can be improved. But when that strength becomes an emotional strategy, the desire for order can quietly transform into the belief that if you analyze enough, prepare enough, organize enough, and anticipate enough, you can prevent uncertainty from ever reaching you. And that is where this transit begins to challenge the story you may have been telling yourself. The deeper question is not whether you are capable of managing your life, but whether you have mistaken preparation for control, and whether the need to keep everything perfectly arranged has been protecting you from something you have not wanted to face. That realization opens the door to the deeper meaning of the first illusion, and that is where the next layer of this transit begins to reveal itself. Healthy Virgo energy gives you something valuable, a reliable foundation, practical habits, and a sense of order that can help you move through life without constantly feeling overwhelmed. The problem begins when that useful structure quietly turns into a fortress. You may start believing that every part of your existence must be managed, monitored, corrected, and kept within carefully defined limits before you can finally feel safe. Your identity, your daily habits, your health, your relationships, even your emotional reactions can become areas where you attempt to maintain perfect control. Somewhere inside, the promise becomes very simple. If I can just keep everything organized, if I can anticipate every problem, if I can make every decision correctly, then nothing unexpected will be able to hurt me. But Neptune is now challenging that belief at its foundation. The illusion is not that structure has no value. The illusion is believing that structure can guarantee safety. That distinction matters enormously. The urge to control every detail often develops because some part of you does not feel secure enough to trust what happens when you loosen your grip. Control becomes a defense, a strategy that helps you manage uncertainty when uncertainty feels threatening. It can work for a while. It can even make you feel powerful and capable. But eventually, the same mechanism that once protected you begins consuming the energy you need simply to live. Neptune in Aries has been dissolving rigid individual boundaries since it entered the sign earlier this year, and when the Sun reaches its quincunx with Neptune, that dissolving process can become much harder to ignore. The carefully constructed walls around your life may begin encountering experiences that cannot be organized into neat categories or solved through analysis alone. There are certain questions that a schedule cannot answer. There are certain emotional needs that planning cannot satisfy. There are certain forms of spiritual fulfillment that cannot be produced through more effort, more calculation, or more discipline. If you have recently experienced a strange kind of fatigue, especially the feeling that you are doing everything you are supposed to be doing while somehow becoming more depleted, this may explain why the experience feels so confusing. Your energy can become consumed by maintaining boundaries and structures that are no longer holding in the way they once did. The harder you work to preserve them, the more exhausted you may become. This does not mean discipline is wrong, and it does not mean you need to abandon routines or responsibility. The distinction is much more subtle. There is a profound difference between creating structure because it supports your life and gripping that structure because you are terrified of what might happen without it. One creates stability, the other creates tension. This transit can force you to recognize which one has been operating inside you. The deeper reality is that you are not functioning as a completely isolated system, even if part of you has been trying to live as though you are. You remain connected to the people, circumstances, emotions, and larger currents surrounding you. And when you attempt to control every variable, you can unintentionally block the very movement that might help carry you into your next stage. What you thought was protection may actually become exhaustion. What you thought was discipline may sometimes have been fear wearing the clothing of responsibility. And around this period, that realization can become impossible to push aside. If you recognize yourself in this pattern, there is nothing shameful about it. Releasing even a small portion of that grip can create an enormous sense of relief, because you are no longer spending every ounce of energy trying to guarantee an outcome that was never completely within your control. But there is another illusion waiting underneath this one, and it reaches into an even more complicated part of human behavior, especially for people who genuinely want to help others. The second illusion is the savior trap. This pattern can be difficult to recognize precisely because it often begins with good intentions. Think about the moments when you have given someone your time, your attention, your emotional strength, and your energy because you truly believed you could make a difference in their life. Perhaps you saw something in them that they could not yet see in themselves. You noticed their potential, imagined the person they might become, and convinced yourself that if you remained patient, offered enough support, sacrificed a little more, or stayed beside them long enough, eventually they would change. At first, this can feel meaningful. It can feel compassionate, spiritual, even noble. But there can come a moment when you suddenly realize that you have emptied yourself trying to move someone who never actually chose to move. You look at your own life and discover that you're exhausted, while the person you were trying to rescue remains essentially where they were. This is one of the patterns the Sun and Neptune Quincunx can expose, the savior and victim dynamic hidden beneath apparently selfless behavior. The difficult part is that it rarely announces itself as a problem. It can feel like devotion. It can feel like purpose. It can even feel like a spiritual responsibility. Neptune in Aries carries a powerful impulse towards spiritual identity, action, causes, sacrifice, and the feeling that you have been called to fight for something larger than yourself. There is genuine beauty in that impulse, and it would be wrong to dismiss every act of service as unhealthy. But this transit asks you to look beneath the surface of your motivation. Are you helping because someone truly needs support, or because being needed has become central to your identity? Are you supporting another person, or are you unconsciously trying to control the outcome of their life? Sometimes the role of rescuer becomes a way to avoid the uncomfortable experience of sitting alone with your own unanswered questions. If you are constantly focused on fixing another person, you do not have to confront what remains unresolved inside yourself. If someone always needs you, you never have to ask who you are when nobody is asking you to save them. And that is where this second illusion becomes deeply personal, because the desire to rescue another person can sometimes conceal a desire to feel indispensable. The next layer of this pattern becomes even more revealing when you turn the situation around and examine what happens when the person being rescued does not change. There is another side to this pattern that you need to examine carefully, because the role of the victim can become just as complicated as the role of the rescuer. When someone repeatedly sees themselves as the person who is always disappointed, always giving more, always being ignored, or continually being used by others, that identity can sometimes become a way of avoiding responsibility for the choices that help create the pattern. That does not mean every painful experience is your fault, and it certainly does not mean generosity is secretly selfish. That is not the message here. The deeper invitation is to become honest about where you have been abandoning your own needs while convincing yourself that sacrifice automatically equals love. This transit can bring those hidden compromises directly into your awareness. You may suddenly recognize the moments when you noticed warning signs, but chose to overlook them because you desperately wanted to believe in someone's potential. You may remember how often you kept giving, even after your own emotional resources were depleted, then called that exhaustion devotion. You may finally see that continuing to pour from an empty emotional reservoir does not always create love. Sometimes it creates resentment, depletion, and a quiet loss of yourself. The timing on August 26 makes this particular realization even more powerful. Approximately 4 hours before the Sun reaches its exact quincunx with Neptune, the Sun first forms an exact quincunx with Pluto in Aquarius. That sequence matters because Pluto has a very different way of revealing what has been hidden. Pluto brings attention to the power structures underneath an interaction, the control, the manipulation, the imbalance, and the dynamics that may have been difficult for you to acknowledge. It can expose what exists beneath someone's words and beneath your own explanations for why you have continued giving. Then Neptune arrives, bringing its atmosphere of uncertainty and sensitivity. But by that point, Pluto's already begun pulling back the covering. The result can be an uncomfortable moment of recognition, where you suddenly understand that your devotion may have been directed toward a situation, relationship, or person who was never capable of giving the same energy back. If you recognize yourself in that experience, do not turn the realization into another reason to criticize yourself. Seeing the pattern does not prove that you were foolish. It proves that you are becoming conscious of something you previously could not fully see. There is courage in admitting that a boundary needs to exist. There is strength in recognizing that saying no does not make you cruel, and protecting your energy does not make you selfish. Sometimes, the most compassionate choice you can make is to stop participating in a dynamic that continuously empties you. And just when you think that realization is enough, the third illusion takes you somewhere even more personal, because this one involves the way you interpret your own inner signals. The third illusion is confusing anxiety with intuition. This is an especially sensitive subject because so many spiritually minded people experience powerful feelings, sudden impressions, heightened empathy, and moments that seem to arrive from somewhere beyond ordinary rational thought. Under the Sun Quincunx Neptune, that boundary can become exceptionally difficult to distinguish. Your sensitivity may increase dramatically. Your imagination can become more active. You may experience moments of profound knowing that appear suddenly, without a logical explanation, and there can be genuine value in learning to listen to that deeper awareness. But the same heightened sensitivity can also create another experience that feels remarkably similar at first: fear. Anxiety can disguise itself as spiritual perception. Hypervigilance can begin to look like awareness. A persistent internal alarm can be interpreted as evidence that the universe is trying to warn you about something, even when the feeling is actually being generated by uncertainty, fear, or an unresolved emotional wound. This is where you may need to become especially honest with yourself. There is a pattern within spiritual communities that this transit can bring into sharper focus, and that pattern is spiritual bypassing. Spiritual bypassing happens when spiritual ideas are used to avoid confronting practical problems that require direct attention. Anxiety can be renamed an energetic download instead of being examined for what it actually is. A harmful relationship can be described as a karmic contract, rather than being confronted as a relationship that may be damaging you. A physical concern can be interpreted as the body adjusting to a new frequency, instead of seeking appropriate medical attention. Energetic experiences may absolutely feel real and meaningful, and that reality does not need to be dismissed. The important distinction is whether spiritual language is helping you understand reality more clearly, or helping you avoid reality altogether. That is precisely where the Virgo Sun becomes essential. Virgo asks for something concrete. It wants evidence, usefulness, practicality, and observable results. It asks you to examine whether the belief you are holding actually improves the way you live. Does it help you make wiser decisions? Does it help you function more effectively? Does it encourage you to treat yourself and other people with greater honesty and care? Does it help you recognize problems and respond to them responsibly? Or does the belief simply make you feel spiritually significant while the circumstances of your actual life remain unchanged? That question may feel uncomfortable, but discomfort does not make the question unnecessary. In fact, this is the kind of reality check that can protect genuine intuition from being buried beneath fear. Real intuition has a different quality from anxiety. Even when the message is difficult, intuition tends to carry a sense of inner steadiness and clarity. Anxiety behaves differently. It scatters your attention. It creates endless scenarios. It loops through possibilities and repeatedly demands another answer because the first answer never feels safe enough. Anxiety grows through repetition, while intuition can arrive with a quiet certainty that does not require constant mental escalation. That distinction becomes extremely important under this transit. So when a powerful feeling suddenly rises inside you, do not immediately declare that it is a message from the universe. Give yourself a moment before assigning meaning to it. Become curious about the sensation instead of obeying it automatically. Ask whether the feeling is grounding you or destabilizing you. Ask whether it is bringing greater clarity or creating more confusion. That pause may become the difference between hearing your deeper wisdom and simply giving your fear a spiritual vocabulary. And once you begin recognizing that difference, the final layer of this transit can become much easier to understand. The real test of this entire transit may be learning whether the signal you are receiving is genuine inner guidance or simply the noise created by fear. And this distinction becomes even more important when you begin noticing how your body is responding. If you've been wondering why you suddenly feel physically different, why your energy seems lower than usual, or why things that never bothered you before suddenly seem to affect you, there is an astrological explanation within the framework we're exploring here. In astrology, the Quincunx is often associated with health because it describes a state in which different systems are struggling to adjust to one another. The body is attempting to reconcile conflicting messages, and that process can feel uncomfortable when the tension continues without resolution. Virgo is part of this configuration, and Virgo is traditionally associated with the digestive system, the gut, and the physical process of integrating what enters the body. Aries is also involved, and Aries is connected with the head and inflammatory responses. So symbolically, you have two very different systems participating in the same tension, each operating according to its own language and rhythm. That can help explain why you may feel as though your body is reacting before your conscious mind fully understands what is happening. Perhaps you have noticed fatigue that seems disproportionate to what you have actually been doing. Perhaps your sensitivity to caffeine has changed, or foods that were previously comfortable now seem harder for your body to tolerate. Maybe you have even noticed that certain environments or particular people leave you feeling unusually depleted, even though you were perfectly comfortable around them before. Within this astrological interpretation, those experiences can be understood as part of the larger pressure created by the transit. The psychological burden of holding on to outdated illusions can also become exhausting. Think about the three patterns we have been examining. The need to control everything requires constant vigilance. The savior pattern requires continuous emotional output. Spiritual bypassing can require you to keep translating uncomfortable realities into explanations that allow you to avoid confronting them directly. When these patterns continue, the internal strain does not simply remain inside your thoughts. It can affect how you experience your energy and how intensely you notice physical sensations. Your body can begin carrying the burden of what your conscious mind has been trying to manage. In this sense, the physical experience becomes part of the larger story. You are not simply dealing with an astrological configuration in the abstract. You are moving through a period in which psychological resistance, emotional exhaustion, and heightened sensitivity may feel connected. If you are experiencing these sensations, do not immediately dismiss yourself or assume that you are imagining everything. At the same time, physical symptoms deserve appropriate real-world attention and should not automatically be attributed to astrology. The practical message is simple: slow down, rest, and become more conscious of what you are allowing into your system, both physically and energetically. Pay attention to what gives you strength and what leaves you depleted. Notice how your body responds, instead of forcing yourself to continue simply because you believe you should be able to handle everything. This is not the ideal moment to measure your worth by how much you can endure. It is a moment to listen more carefully. And there is an important reason for that, because the reality check does not end with the Sun and Neptune. What follows begins to transform the uncertainty into understanding. There is actually something hopeful waiting on the other side of this intense period. After everything we have discussed about control, rescue, anxiety, sensitivity, and the illusions that may be dissolving, it would be easy to assume that this entire sequence is about disruption. I do not believe that is the deeper purpose. The Sun and Neptune Quincunx opens the process, but it is not the final destination. On August the 27th, Mercury moves through the exact same configuration, forming the same quincunx to Pluto and the same quincunx to Neptune. This is especially significant because Mercury is the ruler of Virgo. When Mercury reaches that same apex, the experience begins shifting from something you can only feel into something you can actually describe. The vague discomfort that may have been difficult to explain on the previous day can begin taking shape as language. Suddenly, you may find yourself able to identify what has been bothering you. You may understand why a certain situation has felt wrong, why a particular relationship has exhausted you, or why a belief you once depended upon no longer makes sense. The fog begins to thin, because the mind finally has words for what the deeper part of you has already been sensing. Then Mercury and the Sun come together in what is known as a Casimir, a rare alignment in which Mercury is positioned at the very heart of the Sun. This becomes a powerful symbolic turning point because the confusion that preceded it can give way to direct recognition. The scattered pieces begin connecting. Something that previously felt contradictory suddenly becomes understandable. You may not receive an external answer in some dramatic way, but internally, the pattern can become unmistakable. You realize what the previous days were attempting to reveal. Then August 28th brings a lunar eclipse in Pisces, and this shifts the experience from mental recognition into emotional release. The eclipse occurs directly opposite the Sun, placing the accumulated pressure into a powerful emotional polarity. Everything that has been building, the pressure surrounding identity, the collapse of old illusions, and the exhaustion connected with resisting change, can move through the emotional body. It may surface through dreams, memories, tears, heightened feelings, or emotions that seem larger than the immediate situation. You may not be able to explain every reaction logically, and you may not need to. Sometimes release does not arrive in a polished or organized form. Sometimes it is simply the moment when the body and emotions finally stop carrying something they have been holding for too long. That release may feel messy. It may feel raw. It may even surprise you. But it can also feel deeply freeing. This is the part I want you to remember when the intensity becomes uncomfortable. The illusions being exposed are not being removed as some form of punishment. They are being challenged because they have become burdens. The rigid need for control has been consuming energy. The savior pattern has been asking you to give beyond your limits. Spiritual bypassing has been creating distance between you and the practical reality of your own life. When those layers begin falling away, the experience can initially feel like loss, because you are releasing structures that once helped you feel secure. But what leaves your life is not necessarily something you need to mourn. Sometimes what disappears is the weight that prevented you from moving freely. You are not necessarily watching yourself collapse. You may be witnessing the rearrangement of the identity you have been living through. That process can be uncomfortable because familiar patterns rarely disappear without resistance. Yet when this window begins closing, I believe the change may become much quieter than you expect. When you wake up on August 29th and simply take a breath, the difference may not look dramatic from the outside. There may be no cinematic event announcing that everything has changed. Instead, there may be a quiet certainty inside you. You may notice that something you once tolerated no longer feels acceptable. Something you once feared may no longer control you. Something you once tried desperately to understand may suddenly seem obvious. The shift may be subtle, but it can be undeniable. The feeling that you are no longer standing in exactly the same place you occupied 3 days earlier. That is the deeper purpose of this process. Not destruction for the sake of destruction, but awareness, adjustment, and a return to a version of yourself that no longer needs the same illusions to feel safe. If you have stayed with me through this entire journey, I genuinely appreciate your time and your attention. If this message has connected with something you have personally been experiencing and you want more content like this, subscribing to the channel would mean a great deal. I would also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what has been happening as you approach this transit. Have you noticed unusual fatigue, stronger emotional reactions, mental fog, or a heightened sensitivity that you cannot easily explain? Sharing those experiences can help reveal how differently this same astrological window may be moving through different lives. Take care of yourself during this week. Listen carefully to what your body and emotions are communicating, and I will see you in the next one.